You know, I was gonna do a gun video today, but a lot of things have happened. And you know what? I'm still gonna do that gun video because I think it's become a bit more relevant considering Biden's remarks that he's been making over the day. And so we'll begin the storied history of this particular video with me just browsing through news this morning, where I saw that it was announced that Waco Chipman's appointment to the ATF has now been rescinded by the Biden administration after the utter failure that was his Senate hearings and all of the complete nonsense that he was saying there. Finally, it was done. He's not going to be the director of the ATF, which is a good win, and that is good news. And something which I kind of found a bit surprising. I thought that Biden was going to try and push him in as hard as he can for as long as possible, just so that he can get the perfect man in and have this actual success under his belt, and which has been something he's been lacking for quite a bit, and it's something that he's going to continue to lack. And so the question came out. What is he going to do next? What is Biden's next move, particularly on gun control? Since he is a very radical gun control proponent, it makes sense that he would, instead of completely abandoning his policies, would be a simple change in strategy. And that change of strategy came very quickly, where it was announced that the CDC was going to go back to their gun control advocacy, something that they've been doing for decades, because it turns out that using medical policy to try and advocate for any number of policies which have basically nothing to do with it is nothing new. And this goes all across the board, whether you're talking about Fauci saying utterly nonsensical things about AIDS in the 90s and 80s, or whether it be on gun control, where the CDC was doing a lot of extremely biased statistical research back in those decades as well. It's not that the CDC has gotten that much worse as of last year, as of the last 18 months. It's more that you didn't notice it was going on until just now. And this is one of the better examples of which. And Biden is going to try and use this to push through gun control on any level. He's going to try and say, well, it's a health policy, and considering the utter lack of any constitutional oversight that has been applied to our health agencies, it wouldn't be surprising if he tried to push through straight-up legislation through the CDC or some other health agency, rather than even the ATF, which legislation pushed through there would be just as illegitimate, but it would be less likely to work in the long run, especially with how the courts are going nowadays. And that's where I thought it was going to end. And that's where what I thought was going to be the video today. Essentially, I was going to talk about the gun control policies of Biden and how he was trying to have his strategy evolve. But something else happened. And this is a huge story and something which kind of vindicates my earlier points about how he's going to be using the medical establishment for gun control and justify entirely the original usage of the Second Amendment as laid out by the founders themselves. Because you see, Joe Biden has just gone full dictator mode. It's not even that I'm doing any sort of hyperbole here. It's not that, oh, you're just exaggerating, that it's not that big a deal. No, he is trying to implement a vaccine mandate for basically 80 million Americans. And he is going to do this over the objections of the governors, of the legislator who hasn't passed anything at this point to that effect, and over everyone else simply because he wants to. And this is coming from the guy who was originally saying that we didn't need to do vaccine mandates. And the whole thing surrounding the vaccine issue is quite funny to me, because there's a lot of discussion on the internet about the vaccine and about how, well, if you're not getting the vaccine, you're just going to end up killing yourself. Well, guess what? I didn't have the vaccine. I got COVID in July. And, well, it was a flu. It wasn't even as bad as some of the flus I've had in the past. Now, was it a cakewalk? Was it the best thing I've ever had? Did I feel all spiff and span? No. I did get symptoms. I got a heightened sense of taste and a heightened sense of smell, which for me basically meant that my nose worked for a couple weeks, so that was nice. I had problems with coughing and all the sorts of stuff you expect from COVID, flu, and other respiratory illnesses, including a bit of nausea at certain points. And yeah, it was kind of persistent as well, but did it kill me? No. I didn't even have to take anything for it. I just went through it the same way I do most other diseases of that caliber, and did nothing. And here's the funniest thing, I think, about all of this, is that it seems to me no one on the pro-vaccine mandate, essentially communist dictatorship people on the internet, is that they seem to have a complete misunderstanding of the COVID vaccine, and also of coronavirus in general, because not only do they not understand that the coronavirus vaccine is simply not that effective, and this is undeniable, it doesn't prevent infection, basically at all. It doesn't prevent death, though it certainly seems to help, at least for a time, and it's not long-lasting. It lasts about 6 months or so, maybe even less, depending on who you are and how fast it goes through your system. This is shown very easily in Israel, which is at peak cases, despite having a massive vaccinated population and already doing third shots. That's what's happening in Israel, and we're already starting to get into that area in the United States. And when it comes to the cases, as opposed to deaths, which may have their own problems, when it comes to the case statistics, it's not as though it's a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Because let me ask you a question. If an unvaccinated person gets the sniffles, and they're anti-vax, or they're anti-mask, and all that sort of stuff, how likely do you think it is that they get a test for the sniffles, and make sure that it really is COVID-19? Who's going to do that? The answer, of course, is no one. But compare this to people who actually are vaccinated and seem to get tested on the day. A good example of this, of course, being Governor Greg Abbott, who I talked about just recently getting COVID while being vaccinated without having any symptoms and somehow testing positive for it, because he was testing basically throughout all of his existence, like basically every day. Why was he doing that, though? I have no idea. He didn't have symptoms. Why are we testing people for a sickness when they aren't sick? That doesn't make sense, but it is what we're doing. And vaccinated people still get tested all the time because they're just not concerned about getting a disease with a 99.9% survival rate. And with a vaccine, presumably that survival rate is even better. It's just absurd. And to use the cases as an example of how terrible the pandemic is just as absurd. And to get back to Biden's policies on this particular measure, the most absurd thing is how he is being blatantly unconstitutional, because it's not as though Biden is necessarily claiming he has the power to impose a vaccine mandate on everyone in the United States, or most people in the United States, as it ends up being, because he's doing it for people who are employed, otherwise known as participating in society. Because he doesn't have that power. It's one of a string of decisions that Biden has made over the past few months that have been blatantly unconstitutional, and admittedly so.
If they'll not help, if these governors won't help us beat the pandemic, I will use my power as president to get them out of the way.
It's not as though that Biden is doing this out of an earnest adherence to the Constitution and believing that he has the power to do it. He's explicitly going against it. A good example of this as well is the eviction moratorium, which he reinstated despite knowing it was unconstitutional and stating so at the time that it was unconstitutional. He still demanded that the CDC put it back in place because that's the sort of medical tyranny that we're in at this point, and what we've been in for a couple of decades at this point, perhaps even longer. This is a massive, massive problem. And it goes back to the gun control debate, because I don't believe that Biden's going to hold any restraint with gun control when it comes, when he doesn't have it with regard to this, when it comes with regard with bodily autonomy. I don't believe that he's going to be any less unscrupulous about implementing gun control policies through the CDC or whoever just because he thinks he can. Or not even because he thinks he can, but just because he wants to and has an inkling of a chance of maybe possibly kind of getting away with it. That's what Biden's administration has been throughout basically the entirety of its existence. And this, another thing to put this into context, is at the same time that his approval rating is tanking because of his continued failures and authoritarianism. He is tanking in the polls, including push polls. He's underwater. That's not good, especially for a Democratic president who is benefiting from a massive amount of incredibly biased polls that are the same sort of polls that considered Ohio a toss-up in 2020. These polls are consistently inaccurate, and yet they are even showing that Biden is going underwater. And he's continuing to push, despite having no political capital, despite obviously this particular action being unconstitutional. He continues to do it. And you want to know why? It's because he makes the same mistake as many people on the right did throughout all of Trump's presidency. And that is the idea that the president is the ultimate. The idea that the president controls the direction of the entire country. It just so happens that Biden's putting it into practice much more than Trump ever even attempted to. You see, the thing is, we still live in a federalist society. We still live in a society, in a governed society that has a devolving set of powers, with the states having power, the federal government having power, the localities having power, and all of that sort of stuff. That still exists in the U.S. And it turns out that many people on the right have learned their lesson and are trying to actually take over the local institutions before they try going for the national ones. And this is going to cause many problems for not only the establishment Republicans, who it is directly going against, but also for the Democrats. It's going to cause a lot of problem for Biden because he can't get anything done. All of the local institutions are slowly turning against him. Slowly. By degrees, it's not all there. Obviously, we're just, even still, we're seeing even the depths of the communist infiltration as time has gone on. But it is changing. And I think that's something to hope for. And, well, if worse comes to worse, the gun control hasn't been implemented yet, and that's where I'm going to leave you guys off. I'm KelKidman, this has been Breaking on the Daily, and I'm out.